Hi everybody, welcome to the Romance of Redemption Part 4. I want to start with a question. The Passover festival is celebrated at the start of the barley harvest. The Feast of Pentecost occurs at the start or near the start of the wheat harvest because it celebrates the first fruits of that harvest. Our Redeemer in John 6 is described as the bread of life, and he was born in Bethlehem, which is the house of bread. What is the significance that this romance takes place between the Passover, where they use unleavened bread, and the Feast of Pentecost, where they use leavened bread? Some things to consider. In chapter 1, we're told Ruth didn't return to her mother's house. That is, to the house of an unbeliever with the idols of Moab. Instead, she chose to live with Ruth in the house of a believer. They arrived just as the barley harvest was starting in Israel. And that is the time where they celebrate the Passover. What's the Passover about? It's where they put the blood of a sacrificial lamb on the doorposts of their homes and had God's protection. What has our Redeemer done for us? He is, in Revelation chapter 5, the Lamb who was slain and paid for our redemption with his blood. We also know that bread doesn't leaven itself. Our Redeemer told his disciples to wait for his Spirit to empower them. When did the Spirit come upon them? On the day of Pentecost. Where were they? They were sitting in a house. What happened as a result of that? Over 3,000 people came to know our Redeemer. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Don't go and glean in another field. Boaz would provide the field for her to glean in. He'd provide the water for her thirst, protection from harm, but she had to stay in his field. In chapter 1, Elimelech and Naomi went to another field. They went to Moab. They didn't trust in God's protection. "Stay here with the women who work for me." In verse 1, we saw that Boaz enjoyed a good relationship with his workers. And here we see that he recognised that Ruth needed more than just physical help. She needed social inclusion and relationship building. And he didn't just protect her, as we see in verse 9, but he encouraged her to work with his female servants, which would give her company and help her to build friendships. So he was seeing to her social and emotional well-being, not just her physical needs. In verse 9, "Whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." She didn't have to draw water for herself. Boaz provided for her thirst. At the start of today, we looked at John 6. Jesus is the bread of life. And in that same verse, he says, "Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Verse 10, Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me? We miss something here in the translation because there's a play on words in the Hebrew. Effectively, it's saying, you have noticed the unnoticed. In verses 8 to 13, we see something else. In verse 7, we saw that Ruth spoke with the unnamed servant. Here, in this conversation with Boaz, she is clearly having a conversation. So it's suggesting that she had already learnt Hebrew. This is the day she's arrived. You can't learn a language in one day. So very likely what's happened is in her engagement and then 10-year marriage to Mahlon, she had learnt the Hebrew language during that time. Verse 11, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law. Boaz knew all about Ruth and her commitment before she knew anything about him. Isn't that so like our Redeemer? He knows all about us before we learn about him. Verse 11, she'd left her father and mother. In chapter 1, we're told that, we see that she was encouraged to return to her mother's home. But here, in this verse, we see that that didn't mean that she didn't have a father, because Boaz said she had left her father and mother to come to Israel. We see also in this verse a further connection that we saw in the last session to Abraham, the father of faith. In Genesis 24, Rebekah goes where? To her mother's house. That expression is only used 4 times in Scripture. It's used in Ruth, it's used in Genesis for Rebekah, and twice in the book of Solomon. And in all 4 cases, it's about a cherished daughter. Abraham had a son by Sarah late in life when she was too old to have children. Naomi had a son late in life via Ruth when she was too old to have children. Ruth, if you have a look at this verse and compare it to Genesis 12, you'll see Ruth is following in the path of Abraham. In Genesis 12 it says, the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. When you compare those 2 verses, you see very closely linked. And again, just linking here to the father of faith, Abraham. I love verse 12. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz points Ruth to the goodness of God. Ruth experienced and understood God's love by the actions of Boaz. In verses 7 to 10, Ruth asked why Boaz had shown such favour. She accepted her low position and didn't expect kindness. Here Boaz answers that it is God, not him, it's God who is rewarding her. Boaz is merely the instrument of God, which is reinforced a little bit later where we find out that he's the kinsman redeemer. It's a picture of grace. God is rewarding not her works, but the fact that she sought her refuge in him. We see this in Psalm 57. Have mercy on me. Why? For in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings. It's because of her faith. She has placed herself under the protection of God. This little chick with the mother's wing going over her. Because she has sought God's protection and placed her faith in him, that is the basis of everything that happens in this book. Verse 13, I do not have the standing of one of your servants. Here is yet another connection to faith, because there's another mother-daughter story involving a foreign woman that we see in Mark 7. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And at the end of that, Jesus commends the woman's faith. Ruth, a foreigner, had no standing. She was lower than the lowest servant. But like the woman in Mark 7, she had faith in God. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Another verse I really like that compares Boaz to our Redeemer is in verse 14. He offered her some roasted grain. The word used here means to seize with the hand. In the Hebrew, it's singular, meaning that Boaz personally served her with his hands. Now, we'd learnt in verse 1 that he was a wealthy man, but he didn't let her serve herself, and he didn't get one of his other servants to serve her, but he served her himself. In verse 13, we see that she was lower in standing than the lowest servant. And in verse 10, it implies that she was of such low standing as to be unnoticed. In verse 1, we see that in contrast, he was a man of standing. Yet he was not proud or arrogant, but humble, a servant leader. Remember, this is happening on the day of their meeting, which is at the start of the barley harvest and therefore at the time of the Passover festival. Recall that Jesus, our Redeemer, with his own hands served the bread and the wine to his disciples at the Last Supper, and he himself washed their dirty feet before that meal. Now, we call it the Last Supper, but what was that meal? It was the Passover. Don't reprimand her, even pull out some stalks for her. Normally, if those following tried to gather from the harvest itself, rather than just the leftovers, they would be rebuked. But here Boaz is being generous beyond the law and telling his workers not to embarrass her if she pulls out grain from the harvest. An ephah, that's about 13 kilograms, enough to feed one person for 10 days, or, in this case Ruth and Naomi, 2 people for 5 days. No wonder Naomi was surprised and wanted to know where Ruth had got this. Perhaps here we have the answer to verse 1. Naomi had not sought Boaz out when she arrived. Why? Because she was bitter. But why didn't Boaz offer to help? It might have been for the same reason, that Naomi stopped people helping her because she was bitter. Bitterness poisons relationships. But we saw in verse 11 that he knew how devoted Ruth was to Naomi. And possibly here he saw an opportunity to bless his close relative Naomi indirectly. She wouldn't allow him to directly help because of her bitterness, but indirectly through Ruth he was able to help his close relative Naomi. She gleaned in the field until evening, then threshed the barley and gave what she had left over after she'd eaten to Naomi. So in the notes, you'll see there's a picture of a woman threshing grain. And you realise it was really hard work. It would have taken hours to thresh that grain. So I just want you to think about this. Boaz's unnamed servant said that Ruth had been in their field since morning. She had started very early. When the workers left for the day, she stayed and beat out all of the grain that she had, and it came to about an ephah, 13 kilograms worth. So that would have taken her many hours of work after having worked all day already. And then late at night, she returned to Naomi. We see from verse 23 that she repeated this for 3 months, every day, starting very early, working until all the workers had left, then threshing out the grain, and then going home to Naomi. Notice too, think about this. She had started very early. She worked until lunchtime. She ate her fill at lunchtime and kept her leftovers for Naomi. Then she worked all through the afternoon with the other workers, and when those other workers left, she continued for hours threshing the grain. Surely from lunch until she finished, she would have gotten hungry again. But she didn't touch the leftover food. She gave that to Naomi. So not only was Ruth very hard working, but she was selfless, caring, and responsible toward her mother-in-law. Verse 19, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work?" Naomi did not praise Ruth, even though Ruth obviously deserved it for the hard work that she'd done. But the amount that Ruth brought home couldn't simply be explained by hard work. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Boaz, although wealthy, worked with his servants. He didn't leave it to them to do the work, nor did he only work with the important people like the servant in charge. Ruth says that she worked with him, so it wasn't beneath him to work with the servants, including her, the lowest of the low. Remember too, he had commanded his male servants not to touch her. And from all that we've already learnt and will learn about Boaz, we know that this is a man of integrity. We know something about his character. And if he'd commanded his men not to touch her, we can be sure that he would have led by example. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." Whose kindness are we talking about? In one sense, it's the kindness of Boaz. But in another, it's God's kindness. Remember the repeated links to the story of Rebekah and Isaac in Genesis. In Genesis 24, the unnamed servant says, "The God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master." God was kind to the living, Naomi and Ruth, and to their dead husbands, Elimelech and Mahlon. Through Ruth, through her interaction with Boaz, we begin to see a change in Naomi. In chapter 1, verse 20, she was bitter, but that's starting to be replaced as she recognises God at work. And in chapter 1, verse 21, she was empty, but that emptiness is beginning to be filled. And we see that because here she is praying a blessing on Boaz. So that bitterness, which was poisoning relationships, is starting to be replaced as she's recognising God at work, and she's praying a blessing on Boaz. That man is a close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. In verse 1, we learnt that Boaz was a close, intimately known relative, but here we learn that he was more than that. The word relative here is goel, meaning kinsman redeemer. Such a person needed to have the right to redeem, the ability to redeem, that is, they had to be able to pay the price, and they had to be willing to do so. Our Redeemer had the right to redeem because he was our relative, becoming flesh and blood as we are. He was able to pay the price because he'd lived a life without sin. And he was willing to redeem us even though it meant going to the cross. Notice that Boaz was one of these, which shows that Naomi is aware that there was more than one, as we learn in chapters 3 and 4. Notice in verse 22 the interplay between daughter-in-law and daughter. And we actually see this throughout the book. It draws our attention to this interplay of daughter-in-law, daughter. Why? As daughter-in-law, Ruth is who? The Moabite. As daughter, she is part of the family of God. She is adopted into the inheritance of God. Verses 22 to 23, Naomi said to Ruth, "It will be good for you to go with the women who work for him." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean. We see two things here. First of all, as we saw in chapter 1, Naomi loved Ruth and wanted the best for her. We saw this in chapter 1, where she wanted to protect her daughters-in-law from the racism and difficulties that they would face in Israel. Here, we see more evidence of this, with Naomi coaching Ruth in culturally appropriate behaviour, something we see more of in the next chapter. And we also see that Ruth obediently follows Naomi's advice. In that small farming community, Ruth the Moabitess would have been the subject of lots of conversations and gossip. This culturally appropriate behaviour would have been noticed by those around her. Indeed it was, as we see in chapter 4. We see that the whole community had been watching her, as we see in 4:15, and of course Boaz noticed too. He saw that Ruth was industrious, working from morning until evening. He noticed how she kept to herself, not going after the younger men, and how she carried herself like a lady of that culture ought to, as we see here following the instructions of Naomi. Now I want you to notice verses 1 to 22 was the period of 1 day, but verse 23 is a period of about 3 months, until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. Courtship takes time. In chapter 1 verse 22, their meeting took place at the start of the barley harvest. That normally started in April and finished in May, but could start as early as March. The wheat harvest normally started in May and finished in June, but could sometimes go right through to July. So this is a period of at least 3 months. As we learned in chapter 2, Boaz had a good relationship with his servants. He worked and ate with them, including for over 3 months with Ruth. This happened every single day for those months. We also see that Boaz was clearly a man of God. That means he would not have worked on the Sabbath, and none of his servants would have been allowed to work on the Sabbath either. Presumably, Naomi and Ruth would have attended the local synagogue every Sabbath for those 3 months. During that time, Ruth would have learnt about the God of Israel and the religious customs of the Jews. Living and working in the community for 3 months would have helped Ruth to begin to learn the culture and the social norms. And of course, her Hebrew language skills would have been improving over this time as well. And as we've seen, Naomi would have been coaching her throughout all of this time in culturally appropriate behaviour. The Feast of Pentecost celebrates the first fruits of the wheat harvest and occurs near the start of that harvest. After 3 months of working with Boaz and his servants, of developing relationships with the women who worked for him, presumably both Ruth and Naomi would have attended the festivities for that festival of Pentecost. So chapter 2 closes with a hint of what is to follow, but also with a hint of suspense. Remember that when Ruth committed herself to Naomi and to Naomi's God in chapter 1, it was to a life of widowhood and barrenness. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know how the story ends, but at the time she committed herself to Naomi, she knew none of that. She didn't know what was awaiting her. The same is true again here. There is no indication of what is going to happen when the harvests are over. In chapter 2, verse 20, where Naomi recognised Boaz as one of the kinsman redeemer, there was a possible dream starting. But remember, that was on day 1 when they met, and now at least 3, maybe more months have gone past and nothing has come of it. So she got this inkling, oh, maybe but then the next day nothing, and the next day nothing, and now 3 months later, nothing has come of that. However, neither Naomi nor Ruth ask, what happens when the wheat harvest is over? At this point in time, it appears that they have both come to realise that God himself is their provider. Thank you.